Hi, good evening, everyone. I'd like to thank you all for coming tonight. It's wonderful to see so many old and new faces here around the department. So welcome to you all. My name's Jessica Holmes, and I'm the editor-in-chief of Degree Critical. And tonight we're really excited here at the MFA Art Writing department to relaunch and celebrate our journal. Degree Critical was founded shortly after this department was established at SVA. And over the years, it's seen various iterations, but its goal has always been to showcase some of the outstanding written work that's generated by students here in the art writing department. So, as we roll on into our second decade, we're thrilled tonight to relaunch Degree Critical on its own platform, degreecritical.com. We hope that by doing so, yeah! We hope that by doing so, the bounty of great writing about art will find an even wider audience and readership and become a true journal of record for artists, critics, curators, and really anybody who cares about art. So I invite you all to spend a little time on the website and to see the kind of exciting work that we publish regularly. And to all the writers that are here tonight, I encourage you to pitch your ideas to the new Degree Critical. We're open to submissions from everybody, both within and outside the SVA community, and I would love to read and consider your future work. We're really pleased tonight to have an exceptional group of our both current students and alumni here to read from the archives of Degree Critical. So, without further delay, I'd like to introduce our first reader, Zenny Mae Residoro, class of 2020, who will read from Pastoral Conventions by Michael Johnson, who graduated in the class of 2015. Zenny?
Pastoral Conventions by Michael Johnson. In the original version of the Sistine Madonna, Raphael painted curtains onto the top corners of the canvas. Angels crowded the blue background, and the Madonna trundled her baby. The curtains are rendered as though they are physically present, drawn back to reveal the painting. The curtain's light is daring and significant, as it amplifies the dimensionality of the painting by making its pictorial space seem at once recessed and flat. Historian Hans Belting calls this master trope of Renaissance painting a picture curtain, because a picture, like a window, is framed by the curtain which conforms to the pane of the picture. The painter thereby critiques the illusion of space while simultaneously adhering to it. Discussion of the picture curtain's relationship to the cult of images concludes Belting's book, Likeness and Presence. The curtain, he writes, is drawn aside from an image that is in reality the idea of an image. And what was a curtain at that time, if not the curtain before a cult image, which can conceal or reveal it as a ritual apparition? The practitioners of the cult of images, to which Belting refers implicitly in this quotation, believe that the curtain had a mystical property, in which in order to reveal the truth of images, we only need to pull back. If one were able to completely pull back the curtain in the Sistine Madonna without removing the illusion of space, one would experience an effect similar to that of cinema. The interior movement of the image makes the window pane of the picture seem clearer in the movies, despite having less of a material presence than painting. Presumably, this is because the audience is removed from the technology that projects the movie, the projector. In the Sistine Madonna, by contrast, the picture curtain is presented directly to the audience, thereby foregrounding the material that reveals the image through the ritual function of the curtain. By projecting the image from behind the audience, rather than emphasizing the mysterious facility of the curtain, cinema conceals the susceptibility of the image to being covered up, thus minimizing the effect of the physical curtain and consigning it to mere decoration. As well, the curtain is symbolic here, echoing the history of theatrical space. The ritual apparition which is revealed or concealed before a cult image, but is no longer articulated by the magical ritual of the curtain, is not ritualistic in the movies because the presence of the equipment needed to project the movie is removed from the foreground of the viewing experience. The projection process can be repeated until the power goes out, but the movie will not change unless damaged or altered. When we go to the movies, everything outside this experience may seem to pause, as though the static condition of the movies has caused a suspension of everyday life. When we leave the theater, we may be startled to find that time has passed, that the world is exactly as we left it. To our surprise, the sun has set, and it seems as though a war is being waged by the birds in the trees. But it affects us little, if at all. Everything is shot through with the feeling of the movie itself. We are not displeased. The moving image window pane has developed contours to fit the pains of everyday life. We are left with the impression of an immersive cinematic experience, even when there is no cinema. Life on the outside seems to proceed frame by frame in sultry vignettes. Our peripheries seem to glow. The sensation is warm and diffusive, if a little boring. The movie, if it is good, provides the audience with an enduring image, an image to contemplate and desire long after the movie ends. Pastoral Poetry, as Jane O. Newman, professor of comparative literature at UC Irvine, writes, is self-canceling in the sense that it reduces creativity to a moment of poetic stasis, having more than words in common with cinema. In her book Pastoral Conventions, Newman describes the Order of Flowers, a collective of 17th century wartime poets in Nuremberg, Germany, who banded together in an academy-like endeavor, took shepherd names, chose flower emblems, and wrote massive collective texts at a time when the incredibly destructive 30 Years' War was raging across Europe. Newman's quasi-sociological study argues that, as distinct from Renaissance pastoral poets, the Order of the Flowers wrote in a pastoral vernacular in order to limit their references to the present condition of war in Europe. Pastoral is often characterized as a complementary genre, typically featured shepherds enjoying a period of scheduled leisure or otium, while a secondary narrative threatens to encroach upon their peace. In addition to writing poems in this genre, the poets of the Order of the Flowers adopted the otium of shepherd life. They wrote pastoral poetry in character while the war raged on in Europe. The Renaissance texts are not impressive on the surface. Indeed, pastoral poetry can often be humorously boring. It was the imagination of the texts that had the biggest impact on the lives of the Order of the Flowers, both in the act of writing and its after effects. The act of writing in character allowed their texts to be and do the work of history. It engendered the lived experience of an alternative history despite the war. Like moviegoers exiting the theater, these shepherds entered into a world in which possibility precedes necessity, come what may. The war was elsewhere in mind. For me, the question became how could I analyze these highly stylized texts and the pastoral phenomenon of the order as history, without referring explicitly to the political, social, and military context, in and out of which they developed and which they must, on some level, represent. Newman's answer is to present the pastoral genre as an institution capable of improving life. In an etiological account of pastoral poetics, Newman references Theocritus's Idyll 7 to suggest that pastoral poets proceeded by imitating the bees. The passage to which he refers is an allusion to Comatas, a goatherd who was a slave and a wonderful singer. After Kumatas has been locked away in a wooden chest by his master for stealing a sheep, a swarm of bees funnel into the chest, feeding him honey to keep him alive, so that he might continue to sing. By the same token, the order of flowers continue to sing as long as the honey is flowing, and by singing, the poets will cause the honey to flow. The honey of the order of the flowers was their ability to create turbulence in the linear progress of history, and provide historians with a clear account of the way in which texts can be and do the work of history. The imitation of bees is a mimetic act through which the telos of imitation and survival was capable of improving the quality of life for the order of flowers, proverbially locked away in wartime. Although they were not an anonymous group, the Archive of Pastoral Poetry gave the order a secret way out of the reactionary environment of war. They produced texts that performed the role of history, changing it as they wrote. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zenny. And now I'm very pleased to introduce alumna Caitlin Kramer from the class of 2015, reading from If There Be Any Art in the Weathers of This Earth, written by Colin Edgington, class of 2016. Caitlin?
So I chose this essay or this review because when I read it, I'm an avid reader of Degree Critical, and because we post the best criticism in New York City, in my opinion. And I chose this essay because when I first read it, afterwards I felt really envious and kind of angry that I didn't write it. Like I was a little jealous. But then I realized as a writer, that's like one of the greatest forms of praise that you can give to another writer is both envy that you didn't write it, but then pride that knowing that they're the ones that were always going to write it better than you were. So this is my opinion of that. So if there be any art in the weathers of this earth, by Colin Edgington. A balloon is tethered to the front office of All-Star Mobile Homes in Mark Steinmetz's photograph, Athens, Georgia, Balloon at Dusk, 1995. A symbol for celebration, it floats high in the ambient sky, marked by the flags that indicate its string. A soft dusk glows from beyond the firmament, defining the balloon's silhouette and dotted tail like a long exposure in a negative. My eye is drawn below to the gray ground where the mobile homes are dotted with festive lights, a grand opening perhaps. The grass looks maintained, the fence is intact, the siding is clean and might even be new. I imagine that soon all will be in blackness and those twinkling electric lights will punctuate the void and the balloon will stay in the night sky, an isolated stranding in the dark. But this photograph, emblematic of Mark Steinmetz's recent exhibition South at Yancey Richardson Gallery in New York City, will never grow dark nor light in the rhythm of earthly rotation. That perfect black circle, like a hole punched through the negative, will remain in place. Pulling taut its tether towards the heavens, its freedom dependent on the strength of the string. But most likely its life is destined for deflation, a slow, crestfallen descent back to Earth. The balloon, like most of the subjects in these photographs, is caught between states, between terrestrial bonds and cosmic desires. Steinmetz's photographs have the initial tinge of 20th century documentary work. They are black and white gelatin silver prints and shot as if on the move. The images exhibit the dynamism of an acute eye navigating a familiar world of fleeting circumstances. It is clear he is working within a tradition set forth by Henri Cartier-Bresson to Robert Frank, Deanne Arbus, and Gary Winogrand. In fact, Steinmetz, a graduate of Yale's photography program in 1986, photographed and learned from Winogrand in Los Angeles during the early 80s. But the photographs in this particular exhibition, pulled from his series Southeast from 1994 to 2001, along with newer works, are not explicitly personal, socioeconomic, political, or cultural in the sense of these forebearers, nor do they solely rely on the visual geometry of a decisive moment. This is not to say these images are without these things, but that they are not at the forefront of the meaning of the work. Photographic exposures are inherently decisive. Even algorithms are built to perform decisive tasks. But here, the visual relationships created within the frame, between pictures and through time, act as catalysts to a more inconspicuous ideas. This is important because it seems Steinmetz is chasing time immemorial and its ever-present manifestations. What is imaged is invisible, using the surfaces of the physical world to record a duration of intuition, of feeling, of mood, of all the things that brew in the belly of life. These works, in their current curated form, convey a geography of sunken souls and charged spaces that are as ripe as ever. A latency slowly develops through the quotidian nature of this work. Everywhere people are missing. Their bodies inhabit the space that Steinmetz has photographed, but their gaze, their expressions, betray the presence of their absence. This sense of absence works slowly as one navigates the gallery space of Yancey Richardson. The alternating portraits and social landscapes play off of one another like paratactic imagery. Collectively, the photographs reveal the weight of memory and raw existence, a burden embedded in the southern U.S. landscape and carried by the people of its lands. The vantage point of the photographs vary in their approach. Some are taken at eye level, others from below looking up, or from above looking down, or from a crouched position, but all give way to the monocular vision of the camera's eye. In 2015, Steinmetz responded to MoMA's Photography at MoMA 1960 to Now exhibition, lamenting the loss of a kind of photography that, quote, interrogates the world that we actually live in as it actually looks. In his review, he speaks of a cold atmosphere dominating photography in the art world, conveyed by pictures that illustrate ideas and photographs of concepts over the, quote, photographer as auteur who views photography as a kind of cinematic literature. This desire for a kind of visual storytelling in the aggregate is evidenced throughout the exhibition, which leads viewers on a cinematic journey from still to still, where meaning lives between pictures. Like Stone Mountain, Georgia, a couple lying on a rock, in which a man and a woman lie on their backs, the tops of their heads facing the camera in silhouette as light shafts break through the clouds and reach the earth in the distance. The couple's arms create a perfect expression of symbiosis, bent at the elbow with their triceps on the ground. Their forearms lean towards one another in the air, where their hands begin to entwine. The tip of the man's left thumb rests softly against the woman's, which is wrapped in a Band-Aid. His other hand, in a gesture evoking Michelangelo's Adam, the receiver of the faithful speech, solidifies the biblical underpinning of the work, but also points to the innocence, beauty, and drama of youthful love. This photograph is on its own wall at the end of the small gallery off of the main. It is surrounded by people in isolation: goth girl, man in kudzu, boy in the car window, girl at fence, baby on blanket, and girl with camera. Yet on the opposite wall, across from the couple, is Atlanta, Georgia, father and son by gas station, a photograph of another pair, a father and son, the child's entire body held against the man's in a loving, safe embrace. As such, these photographs reveal characters and mess and scenes which speak towards larger narratives that transcend the particularities of the photograph's circumstances. This elevation is due as much to the use of framing, light, and remarkable printing as it is subject matter. The works have a silvery texture, as if lit by moonlight rather than the sun. I wondered as I walked through the exhibition if there were any true whites in these prints. In Steinmetz's review of the MoMA show, he criticizes the photographs for their intellectual prowess and mass media examinations, their abandonment of the world out there. Worst of all for Steinmetz, quote, fewer still could be considered interrogations of the self. In his understanding of true self-navigation, Steinmetz conceived of a raw, sincere, critical, and honest exploration of one's own sense of place and identity, discovered through the act of image-making. This is particularly poignant in an age of distraction, ego inflation, self-promotion, brands, factional party affiliation, and semiotic identification. In a time when the self is a mere function of the outer forces reliant on superficiality, Steinmetz's fastidious dedication to the circumstances of its formation and the lines drawn between those circumstances point the way to a balanced existence in the 21st century. These are stand-ins of a cinematic literature on the self. And from that, particularly in these intrepid times in which deception and falsehoods are exchanged like currency and divisiveness spills into violence, we can all take note. We are at risk of forgetting the self in its truest sense. In the penultimate scene of Cormac McCarthy's semi-autobiographical novel, Sutri, Cornelius Sutri, a stand-in for the author, breaks down in his isolation and compels the heavens to call lightning down. McCarthy wrote, "It cracked and boomed about, and he pointed out the darkened heart within him and cried for light. If there be any art in the weathers of this earth, or char these bones to coal, if you can, a blackened rag in the rain." The search for one's place in the world is drawn between oneself and the landscape, its people and culture, and ultimately between the terrestrial and the cosmic. This search is mirrored in the work of Steinmetz, except in South, the nihilism that oozes from McCarthy's fictional surrogate is instead tinged in the landscape itself, and the people we find, the carriers of light. Next to his photograph, Lightning Strike, Mississippi, in his picture of a man is his picture of a man in Knoxville, Tennessee, Mannion Creek. This man in the creek, his left arm pressing into the dirt, propping him up while his right arm rests on his leg, hand on thigh. His legs are mostly submerged in the murky water. Its muddiness comes actually from the silver quality of the print. The ambient light reflects off the surface of the water. The man's body is twisted such that it may face the sky out of the frame, his mouth agape like Caravaggio's Holofernes. Steinmetz is a storyteller, and his stories take their form as points in a larger constellation. The pictures, images, gather meaning when the viewer draws invisible lines between them, as if peering into the night sky and drawing between stars. As John Berger wrote in And Our Faces, My Heart, Briefest Photos, those who first invented and then named the constellations were storytellers. Tracing an imaginary line between a cluster of stars gave them an image and an identity. The stars threaded on that line were like events threaded on a narrative. Imagining the constellations did not, of course, change the stars, nor did it change the black emptiness that surrounds them. What it changed was the way people read the night sky. Steinmetz's South is an array that operates as a poem about solitude, about despondency, about a longing and melancholy suggestive of personal loss and heartache, about love and beauty, and about the ceaseless running through life, through systems, institutions, beliefs, and the indebtedness to things beyond one's control, but also to the cosmic circumstances that often fuel the existential dread of the modern human. This is the ever-present wound to which poetry speaks, and there is beauty in it. We are ultimately all in this together, lines between one another and the places we find ourselves, earthly constellations filled with vitality. There's solace in that if we can learn to see it. Thank you.
That was very lovely. Thank you, Caitlin. Next, I'd like to introduce Loon Ames from the class of 2020, who will read from Remains of a Day by Emma Drew, class of 2017. Loon?
I'm going to read Remains of a Day by Emma Drew, who is here tonight, by the way. Shout out to Emma Drew. What do we learn about animation from Rachel Rose's Lake Valley, 2016? It's a pertinent question because Rose, a moving image artist who makes videos by skillfully blending her own filmed live action footage with that found elsewhere, endeavored to teach herself about animation processes and techniques. Through a mixture of meticulous celluloid animation, hand-drawn at 12 frames per second, and frenetic, overfull paper collages, Rose puts forth the answer to this and another related question. What do we learn about childhood? As evidenced here, both can be simple yet inscrutable, built on fleeting moments of necessary but tenuous connections. The 8.5-minute HD video recently on view at Gavin Brown's Enterprise is partially sourced from children's book illustrations, largely from the Victorian age. They recall the paper dolls and cutouts of that era, as well as its notoriously grim and lonely conception of childhood. Rose evokes form and feeling as one with these fragments, which are a testament both to the visual culture of the period as well as her interest in self-determination and the solitary side of being young. Lake Valley roughly follows a family, dad, daughter, and a pet that looks like a cross between a dog and a bunny, through a day and a night, though the times and spaces traveled to are indeterminate. Images happen as events in a story. A pot of pasta boils, a tangle of inky blue bubbles and strands of yellow hair. The father and daughter leave the pet at home. A giant egg cracks open to spill its multicolored guts. Fireworks go off. An assumption that images and narrative are meant to work with each other becomes questionable. The logic of their entwining and undoing by Rose's hands seeps into the viewer's consideration of her own recollections. The scenery is either straightforwardly drawn, like the backseat of a family car, or sumptuously constructed like the flowers that look sculpted out of scraps of fabric. Lake Valley has tones, not themes. The joint excitement and boredom of the unknown, the absent-mindedness of children, both wonderful and cruel, and the ease with which they abandon objects and thoughts, the mundane, mind-fucking experience of being within a circumscribed space like suburbia. True to Rose's favorite installation style, two bulky, oversized speakers stood at the back of the open room, rumbling, gargling, and chirping, its soundtrack heavy with both everyday sound effects and otherworldly synthesized strains. Rose likes to physicalize the experience of sound and light when possible, and make the apparatuses of perception known. The exhibition space was open to the outside world via the gallery's raised garage door and the throbbing of the video's environmental soundscape, never quite in lockstep with the images on screen, brought the Harlem evening in. The installation was accessible from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. daily in an effort to enhance the dreamlike world the artist was apparently after. I don't know if the cloudy, dinnertime sky looming to my right fully achieved this. In the dead of night, or nascent dawn, the effect might have been magnified. It would be fun to stumble out of bed and into Rose's world. The transition would not be perfect, but for once, seamlessness does not seem to be the point for her. Rose is first and foremost a conflator of spaces. She'd like you to move from the surface of a painting to a New Jersey cliff in Palisades, 2014, from a Serbian hailstorm to Philip Johnson's glass house in A Minute Ago, 2014, from macro shots of swirling food dye to drone footage of a concert in Everything and More, 2015. She often uses the word composite to describe her work. Her video-making techniques, clever cuts and digitally manipulated movements, previously worked to elide moments of difference, to smooth over, to trompe-l'oeil the edit. Lake Valley is perhaps her flattest work in terms of sheer two-dimensionality, but she's foregone flow for something more realistic or true to life, in the way that déjà vu is true to life. There is little to grasp or submerge into, and the loop is strange. We end up back at the beginning, but out of step. I watched the video for 40 minutes and fixated on a beginning and an end that were not the ones Rose intended. I watched the wrong story. What Lake Valley captures or reveals is not an unbroken stream of consciousness associated with dreams, imagination, or childhood reverie, and the attendant string of images spooling out from one another. Rather, it evinces the jarring nature of such transitions and the feelings associated with not quite knowing where one is in the world, with navigating physical states of matter and emotional spaces at the same time, with the clatter of a meal and the psychedelia of an up-from-below viewpoint. I watched to find my favorite sequence, rather than just follow along. Big waves of burnt orange rolling over cartoon mountains and valleys, a father's massive hand nudging his daughter awake, a cross-section of a knotty wooden staircase, the local school appropriately abandoned in the middle of the night. These are the visual vignettes that stayed with me, cut from the narrative, untouched by the rest. Or are they? As the pet alone in a forest burrows further into the brush, the scenery constantly changes. More precisely, it is replaced, piecemeal but rapidly, with new layers of texture and color and shape. It's a bit like walking on a path that unfolds or crumbles with every step, the pet's curiosity and search for companionship making its satisfaction all the more unattainable. What is a layer? This was the thought in my mind after several viewings, as if the concept so used, particularly in art making and art writing and art thinking, had all along been left unspecified, or here was made particularly alien. Rose undoubtedly sought to literalize her understanding of such a question with cell animation and paper collage. Metaphorically, she targets the wandering, waiting, and the stretches of being alone that overlap and underline a process of self-determination. These are moments that accrue but don't add up. Moments that mean something, but it's not clear what or whether meaning is only in relation to something else, some other part of self or memory. Etymologically speaking, layer, the noun, is essentially the same word as lair, though lair is more ancient and differentiated in sense. In Old English, the shared root means the act or place of lying down, bed, couch, illness, the grave. In Old Frisian, a West Germanic language spoken from the 8th to 16th centuries in the area from present-day Rotterdam to Hamburg, it is simply the situation. In Lake Valley, the situation is one of little respite from the demands of negotiating inner work and inner and outer worlds, even in repose. When the pet can find no companion or way home in the forest, it lies down and dreams, appearing to briefly leave its curled-up body, curiosity unabated. Later, the young girl floats above her bed while asleep. A brief interlude, and then she floats in royal blue bathwater, her face, hands, and pillow rising to the surface. As she wakes up, she tosses her head from side to side, and the image of her face lingers in two places at once, a bleary-eyed, peach-cheeked Janice. This is the most affecting visual articulation of layers of meaning made visible in this moment of suspended stirring. Here, Rose's animation reflects the relationships we have with the clandestine places called dreams, imagination, and even very intense emotions, places happened upon that don't fully relate to their surroundings. These worlds within worlds, mirroring and unsettling waking life, define human geography and a budding self-articulation. In the fantasy life of a child playing with paper dolls is a traversal of such spaces, experiences, images, and raw feelings that we assume someday will all connect. Thank you. Thank you, Emma.
Thank you so much, Loon. Next up, we're going to hear from Chetan Asadikan, class of 2017, and Degree Critical's managing editor extraordinaire. I don't know what I would do without her. Cheatham is reading from Memory Loss as Wilted Inspiration by DJ Boyd, class of 2017. Cheatham?
Hi. Memory Loss is Wilted Inspiration by DJ Boyd. Quote, "It's some wish of another I remember, or don't remember and continue not to remember. I start to remember and continue not to. No, it's a dead state." End quote. She experienced a desire. Lucy Ives, The Hermit. Often I have trouble remembering things. Memorizing phone numbers and names is hopeless. My general knowledge history is appalling. I think I can't recall verbatim the last conversation I had, therefore I had failed. I work myself into a lather, imagining that I'm going senile already or that functionally there's little difference between senility and a mind that has outsourced its entire ability to remember to computers. Sometimes I'll forget something that amazed me when I first learned about it. Then, learning about it again, I'm no less amazed than I was for the first time. When that happens, and then I remember moments later that I'd actually learned this thing once before, I'm not sure what's more striking. The thing I learned, or that I could ever have forgotten it, or that my forgetting has doubled my pleasure, cloned it, and then cleared the way for repeat injection. I'd give an example, but I can't remember now. In any case, it's possible wonder can be enriched, deepened, and when it's contingent on your own forgetting, becoming aware of your own forgetting, that can also be a revelation. Maybe memory loss is a kind of wilted inspiration. In Lucy Ives' The Hermit, the Song Cave 2016, there are 80 numbered entries consisting of deadpan quotations, titles of books to read, shriveled lists, aphorisms, literary tweets. Ives, a New York-based writer and co-editor at Triple Canopy, explains that they are fragments of texts gleaned from old notebooks and journals that she recognized would never have fit elsewhere as legitimate writing, mainly for their smallness. They had to be bundled together, gathered like wild mushrooms. Still, the harvest is lean. An entire page, entry 26, reads, "A hut is a small house." It's maybe not possible to open the book without the feeling that you're cracking a text that, if not mummified, seems at the very least smothered or deposited beneath layers of unbreathing cotton. That's a credit to the cover, which has been submerged into the sort of blue that, as Gerda suggests, draws us after it rather than advance towards us. The condition of the writer is a nagging subject of many entries. Neither the condition nor the treatments of it is glamorous. Essay writing is said to occur in dog years, where it isn't a task of reasoning so much as something that befalls one. Or later, in an even bleaker diagnosis, I discover that writing as a profession is about putting oneself into a constrained position from which there are limited means of escape. The undertaking is not about the words themselves or even some technical skill distinct from survival. One must possess only the ability to tolerate a given position long enough to make it intelligible to others. This might read as encouragement or ennobling without context, but beside the rest of the numbed entries of the book, we're given to understand that there is little to enjoy in a vocation that requires of its practitioner nothing more or less than the patience of an ascetic. Quote, ability to tolerate might be well translated here as, quote, inurement to suffering. For all this fatigue, both for the reader and the narrator, it felt impossible that these words could be effectively read aloud. These texts seem not only not vocalizations, but even anti-vocal. The various lists here feature words half evacuated of meaning and also of their own presence, words that have piled muteness onto themselves like doomed yet industrious beetles. Sometimes this process of effacement is literal, as in her list of Loreen, where 2 lines have left words behind altogether. A, abstraction. B, light plus shade. C, italics. D, serifs. E, quotation mark. F, and many times. G, single quote, single quote, single quote, single quote. H, I've seen it there. Even when people are being quoted, it's not as though they're speaking. The quote seems so far interred in the narrator's forgetting that the words cannot reconnect with their voices of their original speakers. Entry 12. Someone says, charm plays a certain role in getting someone to trust you. That this says is rendered in the present tense rebukes our attempts at comfortably dispensing with the quote as something that had once been spoken in time, but is now past. The utter neutrality of the someone says renders the whole page so bloodless and devoid of tone that the content of the aphorism almost vanishes. One does not, indeed cannot, read for meaning here, but rather for the conspicuous grafting of blankness onto words removed from context. Beside its banality, we struggle to commit the sentence to memory because it didn't happen, that somebody said it. We can't pin this on the donkey of history. And yet its present tense denotes no presence to speak of that could situate the quote in a tangible now. Somehow the tensing denotes the opposite. Like the most depressing water wiggly, you can't hold on to it. it keeps receding further into itself, farther from flesh into writing. Thank you.
Thank you, Cheetah. Next, I'm happy to introduce Hakeem Bishara from the class of 2017. Hakeem is reading from Dressing for Space by Janelle Mannion from the class of 2017. Hakeem?
Janelle lives now in a small seaside town in Ireland called Clare. It's dreamy. She's Irish. And those Irish know how to write, and you'll see it here. Watch me butcher this. Dressing for Space. There is a scream that goes on until it feels normal, until the alarm reflex has long passed. Not obviously tethered to a body, this scream fills the kitchen's vast performance space, a black box at the center of which sits a two-story scaffold structure, moodily lit. This space is the setting for the performance element of Ralph Lemon's Scaffold Room, which exists as a complex of readings, performances, and an exhibition occupying both floors of the kitchen. The show unfolds in two distinct halves, the first performed by Okawi Okpokwasili, a hard name to pronounce, and the second by April Mathis. The scream belongs to Mathis, but she has retreated to some recess in this dark space, and its impact is undiluted by an attachment to any visual source. The scream itself becomes a sonic environment that is lived in, as if its shrill frequency were a default setting. One stops waiting for it to end, submitting instead to a passive state of emergency. Another moment that climbs inside time and stretches it out. Mathis arrives on stage, profoundly unhurried, in the charged wake of Okpokwasili's performance. She sits on the floor and props herself up, her legs splayed out like a doll. She begins to absently emit the words of Beyoncé's song Party, which escaped from her lax mouth at the pace and pitch of a leaking air mattress. Her body is not invested in enlivening the song's delivery or in moving it along. She looks at her nails. There's a claustrophobia produced by moments like these that shifts from one's mode of attention and gives way to complacency. They are experiences as deflationary counterpoints to the frantic restlessness that is generated in the first half of the performance by Okpokwasili's manic energy, by her breakneck romp through increasingly bizarre songs and costume changes, each performative fragment punctuated by level and controlled thank you very much. When it seems like there is nowhere for her else to go, she puts on a spacesuit. Throughout Okpokwasili's performance, there's a sense of oppressively unlimited scope of possibility for movement. That is, for moving beyond the activity or place or costume at hand. Dead is something you can be, she says at one point. Although transgression is always an option, she seems compelled to try and exhaust things anyway. Pop culture, the planet, even her own body, which is worked up into a blurred frenzy as if trying to erase herself. But it doesn't matter if this erasure is achieved, because she has another body. Its current form is just one iteration of the character that she and Mathis share. The stage can only hold these bodies one at a time. Okpokwasili's departure halfway through the performance makes room for Mathis. Containers and frameworks of all shapes are collapsed. Identities leak from bodies, and planets become readily permeable membranes. One experiences a revving and yielding of the body's internal time. Okpokwasili's feverish energy is abruptly weighed down, thickened by Mathis's slow, sober movements. If momentum's range is inexhaustible, so is the depth of a singular moment. The tension between these polar velocities is stunted by the references to literature and pop music that are woven throughout. Beyoncé, Kathy Acker, and Herman Melville mingle in the air above the podium. Within this tumult of references, there's a slippage between generations of artists that perhaps reveals as much sameness as difference. Janis Joplin fades into Amy Winehouse, quote, white girls with black voices, end of quote, who are still dying at age 27. Well, this is long, so I'm gonna skip forward. And Janelle hovers to the second floor where there's a video of 4 old people trying to build a spaceship in their backyard. And there's also a reading room with books. And she ends with going back to the first floor. Downstairs in the performance space, between shows, another video plays. A collage of all the scenes in Andrei Tarkovsky's Solaris that don't have people in them. It presents a disquieting calm after the performance's body-laden storm, the universe emptied of implacably transgressive human energies. This cleansing gesture of lemons generates a lacuna, an opportunity to reimagine how bodies might occupy space. The moments of illumination orchestrated by Lemon's scaffold room are invariably fostered by such unmapped enterprises. A spaceship is fashioned from household junk, and its door left just noticeably ajar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hakeem. And last but not least, I'd like to cap off this evening of readings by introducing Angela Davignon, class of 2020, who will read from Painted by the Sky by Sam Swayze, class of 2013. Angela?
Thank you. Hi. Sorry, I'm going to adjust this. Okay. Painted by the Sky by Sam Swayze. There is on occasion a moment when an artist's career becomes inseparable from who they are, when their work is not simply a byproduct of life, but is life itself. While this moment could occur in a flash, it is more likely that it spans their entire life and sometimes transcends it for generations to come. A moment. Whether it is one's realization of another's virtuosity, or when the other achieves a certain level of notoriety, a lifetime of devotion, or when one recognizes a lifetime's worth of creative activity, there is at times a moment when we begin to refer to an artist's work not as objects apart, but interconnected pieces, like everlasting breaths of their creator. The painting is not by Jane Wilson, it is a Jane Wilson. We often speak of a work of art as if it were the artist herself, because that is precisely what it is, particularly in the case of Jane Wilson. A painter of landscape, skies, and lived experiences rather than abstraction, for her the act of painting was one of creating memories. For nearly 70 years, it was the process that formed who she was, each brushstroke bending the trajectory of who she became. Luella Jane Wilson was born on her family's farm outside of Seymour, Iowa on April 24, 1924, to Wayne Wilson and Cleone Margaret Marquis. The late 1920s and especially the 1930s was a time of profound distress for the Midwestern plains and likewise for the farmers who depended on them. Various political factors during and after World War I had caused crop prices to increase. Farmers, some of whom were now equipped with efficient gas-powered machines, overextended their agricultural reach into greater and greater swaths of land, expediting the overgrazing that had begun as early as the 1890s, which eradicated native grasses that served to hold the soil in place. The Dust Bowl formed at the arid bed of the Great Plains, accompanied by intermittent but extreme droughts and severe winds. Earth was sent skyward, and moving storms of dust replaced days with horrific nights from Canada to Texas. At an early age, on card trips the family took, she learned that the whole world was not a replica of where she had been born. You put 2 kids in the back of a car and a chicken in the front and the cast iron frying pan somewhere else and you can drive for 2 weeks. And drive they did, through the vast and ever-changing landscape of America, through the Badlands, profound and otherworldly, a geological anomaly, like prehistoric sandcastles dripped from prisms in the sky. Through the southeastern United States, where she recalls seeing razorback hogs running wild, and through the valleys of California and the moving fogs of San Francisco, where she was confronted by the ocean for the first time. For young Jane, America was a landscape at the conclusion. At the ocean, she viewed both the end and the beginning of the rest of the world, having once thought all of it was contained by the horizon line on the outskirts of her hometown. From imagination come dreams. As a young person in dreams, we picture ourselves and the possibilities of who we might become. As a young American, imagination is often ignited in the dimly lit theaters and projected light where we find, to appropriate Humphrey Bogart's modernized rendition of Shakespeare, the stuff that dreams are made of. For Jane, who she might become was Hedy Lamarr. In a leather-bound photo album of Jane's on a crumpled black page, ripping at the edges and labeled Spring 1940, are small photos of her and her sister Anne, with Clark Gable, Ms. Lamarr, and another woman who looks to be Claudette Colbert. That year, Jane was at that wonderfully mysterious, vibrant, chaotic, hormonal age of 16, crouching in a darkened cinema seat, snapping shots of her favorite stars. Below these screenshots are headshots of the elegant Lamarr cut from magazines. On the following page in Jane's album are pictures of her and Anne posing with an unlit cigarette. Jane's hair is done up like Lamarr's, and she poses as if caught in mid-conversation about something utterly refined, here in the limelight, turning heads. It appears that early on Jane was well aware of the type of woman she would like to become, but she would not be judged by her good looks alone. In 1941, at the age of 17, Jane enrolled at the University of Iowa. Apart from studying painting and art history, she also played the oboe in bands. It was during her time at the University of Iowa that Jane met John Gruen, a young man fresh from military service who spoke with something nearing a Central European accent, having been born outside of Paris and raised in Berlin and Milan before moving to New York with his parents at the age of 13. As the story goes, John first laid eyes on Jane while crossing a bridge that traversed the Iowa River, and later, in a darkened auditorium pierced by that projected light from which so many youthful dreams take flight, John asked Jane during a screening of Marcel Pagnot's La Femme du Boulanger if she'd go to dinner with him. She said yes. On Easter Sunday, March 1948, in Oskaloosa, Iowa, the young couple was married. In 1949, the newlyweds flew to New York, a city that was just taking the reins from Paris as the most innovative art capital in the Western world. John, an aspiring composer, and Jane, devoted entirely to painting, found themselves in an apartment at 319 West 12th Street, which only nostalgically could be considered boho chic. Recalling her early days as a painter in New York, Jane told Mimi Thompson, "I floated around the periphery and either disliked or couldn't handle the kind of scrappiness that was an element of the social scene. Her peripheral existence, both in and outside it, stemmed from both her New York life and her childhood in Iowa." Jane was articulate and succinct, with a witty sense of humor and a quiet demeanor that made people hang on every word she spoke. When we consider her paintings from this time, this sense of solitude is ever present. Jane's subjects early on were surrounded, either literally or sensationally, by skies and weather patterns. Eventually, on her way down into her underself, she reached the core, and like light piercing the lens of an eye, all was reversed. The inside became outside, and down became up. Viewers no longer stood on the outside looking in, but on the inside gazing upward at Jane's limitless skies above. In the second half of her career, Jane continued to paint portraits and still lifes, but she was largely devoted to the sky. She produced these land and seascapes from a combination of memory and sensual expression, or more accurately, she painted her skies from a memory of the intellect and like a dancer of the body. Writer Luc Sante once wrote of Jane, "The sky, which has no memory of its own, is tremendously fortunate to have her as its portraitist, its analyst, and its biographer." Even the paintings Jane made from life often have the look of a memory. Her skies can be elegiac and foreboding, filled by longing or hope. They are at once recollections and premonitions. They expose paint's ability to both render the past and to outrun the conscious mind. When I met Jane, she was in her 80s and I was in my 20s. But I was immediately aware that it would not only be cliched, but perfectly inaccurate to consider her in the winter of her years. John often told me that when Jane entered a room, the temperature changed. I believe this. She held the weather and all seasons inside her. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. And thanks to all of you for coming tonight. I'm really happy to have you here, as are we all. And please have some refreshments and enjoy. Thanks.